want to let you know that when somebody comes to present at BRC, it's their responsibility to bring some treats. So what I brought was bacon and some donuts. So just go ahead and help yourself.
Oh my goodness, that's mean.
Oh, how funny.
Yeah. So I'm just, like I said, if it's not fun, I'm not doing it. Well, we'll see. And I'm doing this video because last week we attempted to do we did do a webinar on podcasting, but the Zoom recording didn't work out. So I'm doing a supplement here. So let's just jump into it. So heard not seen podcasting. And so we want to talk about what it is and what it's not and how you can start today. So what is a podcast? And when we were on the webinar, I elicited feedback, what everybody thought a podcast was. And it's pretty interesting. So just take a moment and jot down a few notes what you might think it is. Okay, you got it? So let me tell you what it's not. It's not streaming MP3s. Like a lot of people will put an MP3 on their website and it's hosted on their website server, and that's not a podcast. That's strictly streaming MP3s. So the other thing is, what I get a lot is that when people say, hey, I started a podcast, and then I go find out that what it is a YouTube video. And it's not a podcast. So it's a YouTube video, right? So it doesn't have an RSS feed. This is kind of a note I'll explain in a minute. But you can actually have an RSS feed from YouTube if you know how to get that, which is useful if you're wanting to push it out automatically to people. So it's a podcast if it meets these requirements, and it's very, very simple. It has an RSS feed and it exists. In other words, it's been submitted to iTunes as a podcast. That's what it is. And the reason is that there's maybe 200 aggregators. These are networks, podcast networks that actually pull from the RSS feed within iTunes. Okay, so this is what makes a podcast. So the big question is what do these two things have in common? I'm going to take a minute for you to kind of think about that for a minute. You've got the Gutenberg press on the left there, and you've got podcasting on the right. So the answer is they are disruptive technologies, okay? And we'll get into that in a minute here. I wanted you to be aware of the Infinite Dial for 2020, which was just recently released. And this is most commonly known by the people at Edison Research. And what they do is they cover the complete spectrum of online media, social networks, everything. So we're going to go through a couple different slides. And if you want to get the whole report, you can simply get a hold of me at podcast@allmaven.agency. And I'll be happy to send it to you. So this section right now, I'm just going into podcasting. So this chart really just shows the familiarity of people, like, you know what a podcast is, right? So you can see the growth in 2020 it just keeps going. So back in 2006, and I actually started podcasting in 2005, there was 10% of that number today that really knew about podcasting or what it was. Got to move something around here. It's in my way. Okay. So this is the listenership. Okay. These are basically the numbers about people that are actually listening today. And it's projected that soon we'll be at about 155 million. So next slide. Monthly podcast listening. This is basically, over a period of time, what age groups are listening to podcasts. Average time spent listening to a podcast. And I do believe these are minutes, not hours. But this is based, as you can see right there, listen to a podcast in the last week. So it says right there, hours, minutes in the last week. So it looks like it is hours. That's pretty amazing. Actually, I'm going to go back to that slide because I actually, there are some other statistics I found out that the average person watches about 5 to 7 hours of television a day. So this is the chart of the number of podcasts listened to in the last week. So here are their observations that monthly podcast consumers grew by about 16% year over year. And, I work with Libsyn. They're a media host. They're the largest podcast media host and the longest been in existence. And they come back with about the same number. It's 16% growth consistently since they started. So there's a lot of confusion about this, meaning that a lot of people think there's been an explosion in podcasting, and actually there really hasn't. That's what the marketing people have done. They've led us all in that direction to believe that it's exploded. But the truth is, it's been very, very consistent right from the beginning. So we've got about a third of smart speaker owners having 3 or more devices in their homes, and there's an increased opportunity to produce audio for environments and contexts previously underserved. And what this really means is that more and more people are using smart speakers and listening to podcasts in the morning while they're like making breakfast, eating breakfast, and maybe in the bathroom too. Although the growth in this area is not as robust as you might think. And once again, if you want to get the whole picture, just email podcast@allmaven.agency and I'll send you the whole report. Social media growth. This is pretty interesting. It doesn't really have the trajectory that it used to have. It seems to be ending somewhat, but with podcasting actually is consistently growing. So it's just kind of an interesting observation. So the big question is why would you want a podcast? So think about that for a minute. We know that it's a disruptive technology. I mean, I can tell you part of the reason I love it is because right now we're in the middle of a pandemic and I'm spending a lot of time on Zoom and I'm getting a little tired of the screen, if you know what I mean. But with a podcast, I can simply listen to content, sort of like radio, but it's really, really quite different. Starting a podcast, it's fun. And I'll tell you, it really, really is. And it's a great way to express your authority in your market. So I'll give an example. So Don Sando at the Carlsbad Chamber of Commerce, I got him scheduled into a podcast, which is kind of interesting because it allowed him to get out there and establish his authority on this podcast, but also in his business and his marketing. You will meet some amazing people if you're doing an interview show. And as it says here, it really is a fabulous excuse to interview fascinating people. I have stories about that on my own podcast, but we won't talk about that right now. So it will help you clarify your thinking. So that's certainly been true for me. I have a tendency to slow down when I'm actually doing a podcast. And a lot of times I won't script anything at all, but I will write down some bullet points about the things that I might want to cover in the particular episode. And for anybody that's considering doing public speaking, it's really a great way to get started doing a podcast because you're just going to get warmed up to actually being out there in front of a lot more people. You will earn credibility. And in our culture, it does give extra credit to people who are thoughtful, generous, and well-spoken. And we can learn this skill, even if we don't have it now. The more you do, as I say, repetition is the mother of skill. And then it creates an asset. And, it's really true that podcasting lives on forever. I have a few podcasts I do where there hasn't been an episode released in well over a year, but the listenership keeps growing. So what happens is people will like hear an interview like Joe Rogan, for the first time. And then somebody will mention, did you hear the interview with Elon Musk? And then they'll go back in their podcast app and go back down and look for Elon Musk and start listening. So that's that's an obvious one. But people do go back and listen to older episodes. And then the other thing is that You don't need a permit, a license, or a budget. You can simply begin. And when I say a budget, I mean, it really is inexpensive to get started. I had a client that was spending $20,000 a year to be on a radio show for a half an hour every Saturday morning. And for people that want to get started podcasting, you can actually start for a couple $100 a year. An initial investment of a decent microphone, which we'll talk about, and a media hosting that's geared towards podcasting. And that's going to be anywhere from $5 to maybe $20 a month at the most. And you can just get started now. Whoops. So, and you probably have the time now. I want to let you know that I've been wanting for 5 months to start my own podcast called What Has My Attention. And I recently finally got it up because, quite frankly, I just have a little bit more time. So we're going to go over some history here. So I really like the history. I have a much longer presentation that about 72 pages, which is not going to be a part of this presentation. But Dave Weiner is basically credited with the podcasting model. And it really has to do with the RSS specification, where he was able to add a reference to an MP3 audio file. And there's an example right there in yellow right there for you. So I discovered podcasting because one day, way back in 2004, I'm sitting in front of my computer and I see this code on the screen. And it just kind of looks like the Matrix screen, if you know what I mean. And I looked and saw that there was a reference to an MP3 file. So I simply copied that, opened up a new tab in my browser and dropped it in there. And the next thing you know, I'm listening to an audio file of Dave Weiner. This is back in 2004, having breakfast with a friend of his in Florida and just recording it. And I felt like I was a fly on the wall, that I was just kind of like witnessing, observing, or whatever, and they were having a fascinating conversation. And I realized that, oh my God, this was going to change everything. I'm having a hard time with my presentation going to the next screen. And then Dave started working with Adam Curry. And for most of you, I don't know if you remember MTV, but Adam Curry was the first V disc jockey. He was the guy that was like doing all the music videos. And Adam, there's kind of an interesting story where Adam actually, I don't know if it was actually when he was working at MTV or afterwards, but during this time around 2005, of course, you could actually register a domain. So he registered mtv.com. And a year or so after leaving MTV, as the story goes, MTV came after him. It ended up in court. Adam Curry won. MTV, it made him a very sizable offer on the domain. I'm sure it was millions. I actually know it was. And that funded Adam to really create the PodSafe Music Network. And he went on to do the daily source code. And that's how he really got started. So their partnership really was the beginning of the podcast specification, which allowed all this to happen. So, and of course, the other part of this is that Steve Jobs and Apple jumped into it. The iPod was out there, and they figured out a way to basically put podcasting on an iPod. And I had an iPod at the time. I was on a Windows machine, and actually to use iTunes, and you had to cable up and stick it on your iPod, but you could listen on the iPod from anywhere. So what you're going to hear is basically Steve Jobs talking about and releasing podcasting back in 2005.
Just if you were to eventually get into selling paid audio stuff,
you could try to sell podcasts, but the whole phenomenon is so great it's free. Okay. And I think what we're going to see is an advertising supported model emerge, just like free radio. Here's another. Adam Curry is one of the guys that invented podcasting, and he has a podcast called The Daily Source. Let me go ahead and subscribe to that, and we can go listen to his latest one. Just click on it.
Your daily source code, show number 180. Something remarkable is happening here. Radio is springing free of the regulated gatekeepers who've managed what you can hear since radio was invented. It's jumping into the hands of Anyone at all with something or nothing to say.
With $16 million worth of airplanes strapped to my ass, and the next generation radio content in my ears.
We don't need no stinking transmitter.
I like to think I'm flying into the future. Podcasting. It's Adam Curry.
That's right, it's show number 180, and it's Friday, everybody. Thank God. I've actually had to restart the show 3 times. My Mac has been acting up like a motherfucker. I don't know what's going on. I think it's something to do with the file system.
Okay.
Now, how do you control, say, dirty stuff? I mean,
We're going to have an explicit flag on these like we do the music, so you can know if it's explicit.
so I can find it easier.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, good. Thanks.
All right, let's move on, shall we?
You know, we're going to start with...
I said, let's move on. So now what we're going to talk about is how does the whole thing work, kind of the mechanics of it. And to me, that's the magic of it. And this is a video that Craig Severson did from Podgrunt, which I have not been able to find him or even Podgrant, but he did this in 2006. And to date, I think this most clearly describes to people exactly how a podcast works and how it is for the person creating it and how it is for the person that is actually subscribing.
From the Silicon Valley in California, welcome to the inaugural program of Podgrunt. I'm Craig Severson. So what's a podcast? Well, I'm glad you asked. And if you're familiar with the other shows in the Grunt series, you know we're going to start with the basics. A podcast is simply an audio or a video file delivered to your computer over the internet. And that's it. And you might be thinking, what's the big deal? I mean, we've been getting audio and video over the net for a long time. Well, the difference is in the way that file is delivered to your computer. You see, a podcast gives you a mechanism by which you can subscribe to a program like you would a magazine, but it's all for free. And the content is like a radio or a television show, but it's pre-recorded and lives on your computer so you can look at it anytime. And one of the other cool things about podcasting is that this new method of distribution is so efficient that it allows most anyone with a good idea and some reasonable talent to make a show about something that they have passion for. And because they're unfettered by time or content constraints like a traditional broadcaster would, you can get some really interesting programs that never would have been possible to get before. So we're going to go over the basic mechanism of how a podcast works so you can see how simple and unthreatening it really is. Here's an example. Let's say there's this guy named Joe, and he has this idea for a weekly show about marmalade, because he likes it. And he decides to call it The Joe Show. In his home studio, Joe records 2 initial episodes to get started. With these 2, he feels ready to go public and launch the Joe Show podcast. To do this, he signs up with Acme Web Hosting and uploads his first 2 episode files. And because he's creating a podcast, a special file is also created that keeps a running tab on the episodes and contains basic information about the Joe Show podcast itself.
That's the RSS
We'll talk more about
feed.
this file down the road, but for today, let's call it the control file. Now, let's say you've got a penchant for marmalade yourself, and you've heard about the Joe Show from a friend. From your computer, you launch a podcatcher application like iTunes and ask it to subscribe to the Joe Show. Your computer sends a message to that control file to see if there are any new shows there. And since this is your first time, it indeed finds the first 2 episodes that you don't have, and it downloads them onto your computer. From there, you can listen to them anytime. Now, please notice that I didn't say you have to listen to this on an iPod. It's a misnomer to think you need an iPod to enjoy a podcast. That media file you got from Joe is just like any other audio or video file on your computer, and you can watch it from there. Now, the good news is that most podcasters configure these files so you can play them on the iPod, and that's a big part of the benefit.
Or cell phone.
So now that you're subscribed, your computer will automatically check the control file for the Joe Show to see if there are any new episodes. If there's nothing new, nothing happens. And all of this goes on in the background on a periodic basis, so you don't have to do anything manually. Now, let's say a week passes and Joe has recorded the 3rd episode. He uploads his audio file to the Acme host as before, and the control file subsequently updates as well. When your computer checks the control file the next time, it notes that there is a new episode that you don't have, and it immediately downloads it for you. And that's how simple a podcast works. You, as the listener, let your computer keep you up to date on the shows you subscribe to, and Joe, as the producer, just needs to send his new files up to his host so you and anyone else in the world can get them. You have full control over the shows you want to get, and Joe has full control over the content he wants to provide. This simple method of distribution is the key to the coolness of podcasting. Now, in future episodes of...
All right, so you got that? Pretty amazing, don't you think? So the big question is, what do you need to get started? It's actually very, very simple. And when I started I actually started in 2005 because I was inspired by meeting somebody named Jeffrey Milburn, and he had an art form called OmniArt. And as the story goes, I started podcasting because I met Jeffrey at a party, and he told me the story about being in New York City on New Year's Eve at a wild party, and everybody was like partying except for himself and another man sitting on the couch, and that man happened to be Andy Warhol. So they were both artists, and they struck up a friendship and started like creating art gifts for each other. And pop art was like kind of on the way down, and Andy really believed that OmniArt was possibly the new art form. So they started working together, and Jeffrey was being introduced to other people. Andy went into the hospital for kind of a routine, I believe it was kidney infection, and he actually ended up dying, and that left Jeffrey stranded. And Jeffrey just tried to contact other people about the art form, but nothing was really happening. So it was a fabulous story, and Jeffrey's pretty wild himself. So I just started podcasting with him on the OmniArt Salon, which today I taught Jeffrey how to do all this, and he podcasts even today. He's had, I think, about close to 500,000 downloads of several different episodes he's done. So this is the microphone I recommend. I previously have recommended the Audio-Technica ATR 2100, but this one came out, and the reason I recommend it now is the low end is a little bit better. The stand that comes up with it actually is a lot higher. So with the other one, you kind of had to use another microphone stand or stick it on a pile of books or something. But the other thing is if you're holding the microphone, unlike the ATR 2100, there isn't the noise of the shuffling of your hand on the microphone that the ATR 2100 picks up. So then, yeah, you're going to need to edit. So if you have a Mac, you're probably going to use GarageBand, or if you're on any other platform, you can use Audacity. So Audacity is what I started using from 2005 through most of 2019. And since I started doing audiobooks, I actually upgraded my studio and started using Adobe Audition, which you don't need to use, but I had to because I needed it for the audiobooks I was doing. So it's free. And then you're going to want to create album artwork. Okay, this is typically a one-time thing, and we recommend using Canva. And as you can see there, those are two albums that I created. One for John Sanders for his Parables for Entrepreneurs podcast, which is actually an audiobook that I figured out a way to produce as a podcast. And the reason I did that is he was not concerned about charging anybody. He just wanted to get the word out. And then that branded album artwork is for ALL MAVEN's branded podcast. And then you're going to need a media host. And I highly recommend Libsyn. They are the largest and been in business the longest. And one of the things about them I really, really like is they have great close associations with like Spotify, like with Pandora, and you know, they work together with all these other distribution places or centers or aggregators to basically do things right. And probably the biggest reason is your RSS feed is the most important thing that you've got to protect, because it basically is your treasure trove of all the media that you're going to be creating on your podcast. And Libsyn's RSS feed is absolutely, totally rock solid. So that's what I recommend. You can get started for $5 a month. You'll have maybe an hour to 2 hours worth of audio you can do. You could start by doing a podcast every 2 weeks. You can just get started. And then the hosting goes up from there. Most people start with the $20 a month plan, which allows, I want to say 400 megabytes of storage per month. And let's just imagine that you were doing an hour-long show every week or even longer. That plan would suffice for you as well. The other reason to use Libsyn is that on that $20 a month plan. You add $10 to that plan, pay Apple $100 a year and a one-time fee to Google for $50, and they now will roll out your app for your podcast. So the reason you might want to consider doing that is there's a lot of advantages. You can embed PDFs, and it's a single app that basically allows people to call into the show, and there's a whole lot more interaction going on. But the big reason is that a lot of people don't, they're used to going to their app store to download stuff. For them to do searches for podcast in whatever app they have seems to be a little bit more difficult. But if you have an app, you just point them to downloading the app because everyone's used to using the store. So we shall move on. And you might need a coach, which is what I do. So you can always get a hold of me at podcast@allmaven.agency. So one thing you hear is that you really, really want to be kind of unique. So what you're looking at right now is the branded podcast page. And what you're seeing right now is the audio player that's embedded into the page. And once again, when you host with Libsyn, you're going to end up with what I call a launch pad. And what that is that it's a website basically that includes all the episodes you're doing. It also has interaction and contact us. But once people usually get here, if you're on an iPhone or an iPad and you come to this page, you're going to see a pop-up come up that will encourage you to subscribe. It makes it really easy for people to subscribe. You guys actually have any questions?
Yes, I do. It's Kim Shea. How long
hi,
does the
Kim.
podcast last?
Most of the podcasts I listen to are about an hour, a little bit longer. But there's no sweet spot. Everybody used to think 20 minutes was a sweet spot. You do not do a podcast based on how long you want it to be. You do a podcast based on content. So if it's great content, that's what you go with. That's how long it's going to be.
Yeah, John, one thing that might help everybody is to talk about how you can listen to podcasts and how you can subscribe to podcasts. I think most of us may know, but you might talk about the application side a little bit. Like I love Overcast, but everybody probably has their own favorite one. The one that Apple provides, I realize it's the most popular because it's Apple, but it's very, very feature poor in my view. It does not have near as user-friendly of controls, or in fact, it doesn't have very many controls, frankly. And there's a lot better apps out there. But at the same time, I found the Apple podcast app is the easiest way for me to get podcasts onto my watch, which I like to do.
Yeah, so the reason I went with Pocket Cast is because it is cross-platform. Okay, the one you're using I don't think is. Overcast is not.
What did you say, John? Pocket Cast is cross-platform?
Yes, Pocket Casts.
Okay.
John, another thing you could do is help people understand if they're interested in a particular category or a particular person or personality, how they would find them.
Okay, so now what I'm going to do is basically show you how to get a podcast app and go through a couple different things about searching and that sort of thing. Once again, I'm going to be using Pocket Casts. I do have other apps that I use. Google Podcasts is here. Podcast Addict I used to use, and I got started on Stitcher a long time ago. That's where, with Stitcher, until about two years ago, I'd logged about 3,000 hours of listening to podcasts, and they were all educational podcasts. I had, quite frankly, unplugged my cable and started listening to podcasts, and to date, I can say without question that I've curated the most valuable content anywhere in the world, and mostly listening to a whole lot of people that express critical thinking and just are really, really interesting, and you can do the same. So what you're going to do, if you're on an Apple iPhone or an iPad, you're going to be looking for a purple icon that said podcast. That says podcasts. So, but what I'm going to show you is exactly, if you're on an Android, you're basically going to be going to your Play Store, okay, and you're simply going to be doing a search for podcast. Okay, and you'll get a whole lot of different suggestions. I recommend you just do a search for that, and you'll see the podcast apps that are here. And there's Pocket Casts right there, but I've already got it installed, so I'm just going to jump to Pocket Casts, and we'll basically give you a little tour here. So these are the podcasts that I listen to, and once again, I don't listen to all of them, but I'm going to show you later on the ones I do listen to and why, and recommend maybe you listen to a couple of those as well. So basically what you want to do is you can click on the Discover button. Now, what you're going to be seeing is kind of what's trending, and you can certainly get started that way. But what I have a tendency to do is, is actually just search for a podcast. So once you're there, let's just say you want to like do a search for knitting, because that's what you love. And you just put in knitting and hit the search bar. I'm not sure what you're going to be seeing on your phone, but it's very similar. So generally speaking, kind of the most popular shows usually are at the top. And let's just go on Knitting Pipeline. And you're simply going to subscribe. And this would be also true if you were on an iPhone as well. So there's always a brief description about what the show's about. And also you'll see games and hobbies there. So that's the category in basically in Apple in terms of the category that it's been submitted to. And then there's it's showing the links to a website. It gets you an idea of how often it's released and when they think the next episode might be released. And then these are all your episodes. So I'm going to go ahead and subscribe. All right, so now that I have subscribed, it's listing all the episodes. Now, normally when your podcatcher goes to check to see if there's a new episode, which happens usually at the time it happens. In other words, when a podcaster releases a new episode and Apple Podcasts or iTunes gets updated, it can take maybe an hour or so, but then your podcatcher, whatever you're using on your phone, will go check that RSS feed and list it here and automatically download it if you have your podcatcher configured to do that, which I do. And then what's really nice about Pocket Casts, there are some podcasts I listen to that I only want the most recent episodes saved, or there are some that I never ever want the podcatcher to kind of remove it because I'll get to it maybe, or I'll want to listen to it. But from here you can simply download right now. So it was added to the queue and you can see that it's downloading the episode. So now it's completely available to tap on and listen to the episode, which I'm not going to do right now. Okay? So let me see what's on my list. You can also, look for a specific show. You can type in Joe Rogan, and probably it would just come up, but I'll just hit the search button. Hopefully I spelled his name right. And there it is, the Joe Rogan Experience at the top. Okay. Okay, so there's other shows listed down here that basically are not his shows, but he is mentioned in it or he's actually interviewed in them. So that's the other thing you can do. You can, I really, really, really like Simon Sinek, right? So when I first started following Simon Sinek, I actually went in here and discovered that he had a podcast that somebody was producing, but it went down because the quality wasn't that good. But what I can do is do a search and find interviews with Simon Sinek in other shows. And you can see that he's been interviewed a few times. What can I say? I already showed you the topic of interest, knitting. And I've shown you exactly how to, find somebody here, whether it's his show or somebody else's show. Okay? I'm going to move on. And once again, if you need any help at all, you can email me podcast@allmaven.agency. Okay, so now we're going to answer some questions. So Kim asked about how long shows are. So the unique thing about podcasting is we don't have any of those constraints at all. This is kind of my list of podcasts I listen to. Believe me, I don't listen to them all the time, but there are a few that do have my attention. I'll show you a little bit later on. So what I want to show you is that Joe Rogan's probably the most popular podcast out there. Okay, so he gets millions of downloads for every episode he does. Also, as I understand it, he makes about $36,000 per episode. And of course, he has sponsored content. In other words, he has advertising essentially. All right, so if you'll notice down here, he's hosted on Libsyn, of course. And you'll look down here, you'll see this episode is 3 hours and 27 minutes and 39 seconds. Okay. So I wanted to point out that with Libsyn's players and stuff, you can actually easily share. Makes it really, really easy to share the episodes. So anyway, that was over 3 hours, right? So some people think, and we used to think, that 20 minutes was a sweet spot, and it's just not true. It all depends on the quality of the content. And so it's a lot of times or not a lot, but a few times recording an interview or something, what I'll do is that there's a point where the interview just starts to fall off, and that's when I cut it off. I basically say, hey, we're going to wrap up. So is there anything you want to leave us? Or anyway. And then Grammar Girl, by the way, those are Joe Rogan, as I used to listen to. Grammar Girl was one of the first ones I discovered. And as you'll notice down here, this episode is 9 minutes long. Okay, and I tell a story about her. Basically, she was doing the podcast, and she was getting ready to do an audiobook because she had all these short tips on grammar. And she thought, I can do an audiobook. And she also wanted to write a book. And basically, one of the producers at Oprah contacted her and said they wanted to have her on the show in 2 weeks. They heard her show and absolutely loved it. And so she went to her publisher, and her publisher went to work creating an audiobook and also a book, a written book. So she shows up on Oprah's show and with an audiobook and also her book. And of course, the next thing you know, because of that notoriety, she has took on basically traveling all over the United States, going to universities, talking to students about grammar. So I just wanted to mention that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to cut to showing you exactly how to install a podcast app and search. So before I do that, I want to just show you that I've used a lot of different podcast apps, and I am not on an iPhone, so I'm on Android, but Pocket Casts is cross-platform, and I really, really like them a lot. It's what I recommend. It's available for Apple, available for Google, and if you simply go to pocketcasts.com, if you actually do that right on your phone, you'll see these buttons where you can actually download the app and have it installed on your phone. So that's what I recommend. I actually end up paying a couple bucks a month to actually get the web interface as well. And we're going to be going over this a little bit later on. I'm going to show you some of my favorites and the ones that I think you might want to consider listening to. Okay, so now we're going to have some fun. So Google's been a little behind on this whole thing, but recently they've made a lot of improvements. There is actually an app on Android that you can use, Google's app, and it just really in the last few days they really upgraded it. But one thing I wanted to show you, which was really very cool, is that I tell people that the best way to actually get your podcast out there, a lot of people think it's through social media and all the rest of it. It's just like the best way in the world is by word of mouth. So it's a whole lot like a movie. So let's just say you've seen a great movie and you just absolutely loved it. You're going to be telling everybody you meet. And podcasting is pretty much the same way. A whole lot of the podcasts that I've discovered actually came about by listening to a podcast where they were interviewing a guest who had a podcast, and I would go to that podcast, I would listen to an episode without subscribing, and if I liked it, I'd subscribe. So this is like very personal and word of mouth. But with Google, what they're doing now is indexing podcasts, but taking it a step further. So I'm going to show you an example. There's a podcast I produce called Alternative Health Tools. So I'm going to type in Alternative Health Tools. I don't even have to put in podcast because I don't think, nope, I didn't. So you can see that it came up with Alternative Health Tools, and it's actually listing the most recent episodes. And then of course what you can do is just tap on this button. It'll launch a new window, and you can actually play the episode. Episode 91, Alternative Health Tools Podcast. And this episode is subtitled, How to Lose Weight in a Healthy, Sustainable Way Without Another Diet or Feeling Deprived. Okay, so that's one thing. I mean, it's basically showing the show notes for the episode. And of course, you know, from here, you can just easily subscribe. Give me a second here. So if I click there, I'm going to actually end up on the podcast page. And once again, this is the Libsyn hosted podcast page that comes with every podcast. And you'll notice here that they have built-in links to basically everywhere the show is. So that's Facebook, Twitter, there's LinkedIn. You can email this podcast to somebody. This is the raw RSS feed, and I'll show you what that looks like just because you've probably never seen one before. So that's the RSS feed, you know. So that has all the information about the show in the most recent episodes. The other thing is that a lot of people listen on Deezer. I don't. This is the link to Apple Podcasts. So once again, if you're picking this up on your phone or your iPad, you're going to see a little pop-up that asks if you want to subscribe, but you can also just click here and it will go to iTunes is migrating to Apple Podcasts. So you can see it here. I'm not going to open it up right now, but that's basically how you can get it on your Apple device. So then the other places we're at is TuneIn, very popular. Listen on Stitcher. So if I click on Stitcher, it's going to open up Stitcher's podcast page. And once again, you know, these are all aggregators that pull from the the Apple Podcast or iTunes feed. And they do have a tendency to reformat for their own page, but everything is, quite frankly, just right there. So let's look at another one. Here's Google, listen on Google Play. So just so you know, Google Play is being deprecated. So that's how they first started publishing podcasts, but it's being replaced by Google Podcasts. So when I go to Google Podcasts on a website, on your computer, this is what it's going to look like. Okay. So once again, it has everything. You can just, if you want, you can listen here, or you can also subscribe. And when you subscribe, you'll be using Google Podcasts to subscribe. And then last one I'm showing here is on Spotify. So Spotify is awesome. And everything I publish, and you can too, I also make sure that everything ends up on Spotify as well. So something I wanted to bring up about Spotify is that there are Spotify only podcasts, meaning that people have produced podcasts for Spotify, and they're in some sort of arrangement with Spotify, and they are not released in the Apple Store or the Apple Podcasts and iTunes. We don't consider that a podcast. We consider the RSS feed, if it exists in iTunes and it's in iTunes, basically it is a podcast. But there's a lot of podcasts that are actually in Spotify that aren't included in the Apple Store. So there you go with that. That's a little bit about how to search. I'm looking at my list right now. So let's, part of the reason I wanted to actually mention the search results in Google is that I'm actually training everybody when they start a podcast to basically say right at the top, the name of the episode number, and what the name of the show is. So it'd be like, it'd be like weight loss, episode 91, alternative health tools. And the reason is that when people are searching on Google, which more and more people will be doing, when they hit that play button, they're going to find out right at the top what the show's about, rather than having a bunch of long music and people having to wait to get into it to find out what it's all about. You want to hit them up really early about what the show is about. Okay. So let's go over a couple different shows I listen to. So you can see that I listen to a lot of different podcasts, but not all the time. But these are the ones that, quite frankly, have my attention. So I've got a list in front of me I want to talk about. So I listen to NPR News. Okay. Basically, it is a condensed version. It's like what you'd hear on the radio, but you don't have to be on the radio to listen to it. And they're 5, 6, 7 minutes long. Okay. Given the situation with the pandemic, the other one I listen to, I'm looking for, where is it? Okay, where is it? I mean, on my podcast app, it's a whole lot easier to find. But you can look at everything there it is, San Diego News Matters. So you can see how often they're released here, which is basically daily. They're not terribly long shows or episodes, but it's important for us that live in the San Diego area to, stay informed. And this is really a good one. Right at the top of my list, released generally on Tuesdays and Fridays, is Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway on Pivot. So basically, they went from a Friday only episode to actually expanding to Tuesday. And the reason is they're really, really popular. And if you are involved in any kind of technology and business and at all, this is actually a must listen to. Scott's absolutely hilarious, and he's also really brilliant. And Kara openly says that, she's been a tech journalist, Wall Street Journal, New York Times for years, and she is now making more money in podcasting than she's ever made before. And the reason is it is advertising supported, and she has a lot of listeners, and it's a great show. The other show she does that I really like is called Recode Decode. All right, so once again, it's Kara, and she interviews all the tech executives, politicians, celebrities. I'm just reading right off her page. And she has a little thing where she puts them in the hot chair. So the hot red chair is what she calls it. So there's a really interesting interview she has with Mark Zuckerberg from probably about 3, 4, or 5 months ago. So this is a top listen. I always listen to it. Making Sense, there's actually 2 icons for the same thing, but if you're going to find this one, I'm a member of his organization because I really like what he's doing a lot. So he's a neuroscientist, philosopher, and honestly, I really like critical thinking. This is a guy that started a podcast. He was pretty well known, but he really built himself up by doing his podcast, and then people started wanting more. And the reason is that he was doing interviews with people often on the other side of the fence that he didn't necessarily agree with, but he wanted to have an open debate about whatever topic he was covering. And more people wanted to hear it. He started booking like small movie theaters or performance venues and selling tickets, and people started coming in droves simply to witness 2 people up on stage, maybe 3, but most often 2, to actually witness and experience what an open debate with somebody, 2 people that basically understand what critical thinking is. And it's just fascinating. You can see they cover all sorts of things. So I had mentioned earlier about discovering podcasts. So he recently, in episode 196, does an episode called The Science of Happiness. And this is a really good listen. It's all about kind of just really trying to have emotional and mental well-being during this time that we're in. So I listened to this podcast and discovered that Lori Santos has her own podcast. So let me show you what that one is. So I heard about it and I started listening to the Happiness Lab with Dr. Laura Santos. And so this is really good. She started releasing and interviewing people talking about the coronavirus and just, you know, kind of the science and the psychology and all that stuff behind it and how people are dealing with the issues. So once again, this is like word of mouth. This is word of mouth. I heard it in a podcast. And then because I've done a lot of IT work, but I don't do it anymore, I do listen to Steve Gibson's Security Now. So he's the guy that coined the term spyware. He's awesome. It is absolutely a deep dive into tech, but I listen to it to become aware of the security flaws in so many different things, like the Internet of Things, like, you know, just anything at all that has a security problem. He talks about it at length and often shows people how they can better protect themselves. The other one I listen to pretty much on a regular basis is Stay Tuned with Preet. So Preet Brahera was a U.S. attorney. He actually got fired by Trump. He's really great, and he has really interesting interviews as well. Okay, so and then some of my favorites for marketing. I'm gonna look for Akimbo. I would normally say, if you see it there, point it out to me. There it is right there. So this is Seth Godin's podcast, and I put Seth at the top of my list regarding marketing. You know, he's all about what education was and often still is and should not be, and he's all about helping people just really be creative and make a ruckus. And just go check it out. I highly recommend it. If you're into doing public speaking, where is it? Standing Ovation. There it is. So Standing Ovation, Jay Baer is pretty well known in social media, and he's doing a podcast interviewing public speakers. Love it. And then the other one I really like is called Think Marketing. Where is it? I'm not used to, I mean, if I was on my phone, I could just like absolutely nail it. Where is it? Think Marketing. Da, 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 da. Where is it? I'm going down the list, can't find it. There it is. All right, so Sean's great. Just listen. I think you might enjoy it. Regarding spirituality, human development, that sort of thing, it doesn't get any better than Krista Tippett. She's an independent podcaster that basically now has an organization, and you can look at the list of people that she's interviewing, and just really great interviews. Brene Brown has a podcast now called Unlocking Us. And if I can find it here, there it is. Unlocking Us with Brene Brown. I'm sure a lot of people out there know who she is. And she just recently did a episode with Alicia Keys, which was very good. So if you like that sort of thing, you can check that out. I'm also going to mention my own podcast with ALL MAVEN, and it's branded. So we just recently did an interview with Chris Ryan. He had a conversation with Alexander, or Alex, at ALL MAVEN, and it's great, talking about branding and video and storytelling. So we're going to be releasing another episode in the next day or so with Chris and Reese Harris. That's coming up real soon, and there's several other in the can that we're going to be releasing as well. And then I already talked about alternative health tools, but I had the pleasure of working with Kelly Bagla. She's stopped podcasting last April. You can see the last one was April 30th. And she was doing a show basically weekly and once a month doing interviews with people. And honest to God, her interviews with people were fantastic. She interviewed Don Sando right there, which was the top interview or the top episode that she's had. And, you know, she's all about helping people go legal. All right. For the heck of it, I actually do a weekly podcast with Seaside Center for Spiritual Living. I've been doing this. We're in our 6th season now, and they make it really easy for me because they record everything and they just send me the audio file in a Dropbox, and I produce it. I just produce it. It takes maybe an hour to do, maybe a little bit less. And then I've worked with a lot of environmental organizations, including Ashley Mazanik at Let's Talk About the Weather. Fantastic. This has not had any new episodes since last April, but that's okay because this is a really good example. People still listen. They just go back and listen because these are really fantastic interviews. And really the organization, EcoArts Foundation, which basically hosts Let's Talk About the Weather, is all about regeneration of the environment through art. So there's a lot of scientists, artists, musicians, that sort of thing there. And then Tiny Climate Challenge, where is that? So Myella Manassian was a referral from Ashley, and she's been on a panel with Al Gore. She's a part of the Climate Reality Project, and this show is basically, it's gotten off schedule quite a bit lately with the pandemic, but one show will have a scientist or an expert about a particular environmental problem like plastic. And then a couple of weeks later, we'll bring on somebody that actually becomes the challenger. It took the challenge to reduce the plastic, and then they end up talking about it on the show. It's quite good if you really want to get into that sort of thing. And then really, really proud to be able to be producing for John Sanders. So John wanted an audio book, but he didn't really want to charge people. And so I had to figure out a way to actually do some recording and create in sequence a audiobook essentially. So as you can see, it's like everything is chapters are here. He also has a short thing on top, which is season 2 for the Music Man's Lessons for Sales Professionals. And I will tell you this, if you're an entrepreneur and you're really wanting to grow a business, part of the plan is actually to bring in capital investment. And John knows how to do that. And so this is a must listen for you if that's your thing. And then one of my pet clients outside of ALL MAVEN is a company called Relationship by Design. And this is with Sandy and Lon Golnick. Sandy, well, they're in their late 70s, early 80s. And they went through EST, they went through Landmark Forum, they became international trainers. These people know more about relationship of any kind than anybody I've ever met in my gazillion years working in human and personal development. So go to relationshipbydesign.com to find out more, but the podcast is really good. Usually it's very, very short, but highly, highly, highly recommended. So I think that's going to be it. And hope you enjoyed all this. And want to show you a couple other treats. Let me think, what do we got here? We already did that. So there's a lot of tools in podcasting. This is an app called Headliner. And what it does is it basically takes an audio portion of your podcast and creates a video. So I'm not sure what happens if I tap on this. We'll see what happens. Loading the project. So they actually have a free version, but let me see if this works.
Bacon, Brand, and Branded, Episode 1 with the Maven and the Executioner of Tasks, formerly known as Joseph and Alexandria Polstra. I'm John Biethan, your host of Branded, and the podcast brought to you by the magicians at ALL MAVEN.
Okay, you get it? So it creates this, and then you can distribute this through social media. There's a lot more other tools. The other tool I wanted to show you is freemusicarchive.org. So if you wanted to do some royalty-free music and stuff, this is the place to go to. And then if you want to find out more about anybody in podcasting, provided they're here, is that I basically am up on Podchaser. So it's kind of like a social media for podcasters, But if you go to podchaser.com and just do a search for me as a creator, or just do a search for me in general, you're going to see everything I've done in the last 14, 15 years. So these are the appearances. It says 535, but actually there's over 1,100. So the categories are host, editor, producer, that sort of thing. So I've done a lot of producing, editing, and co-hosting for lots of different shows. These are the most recent, but it goes way, way, way back. There's Omni Art Salon with Jeffrey Milburn as an example. And then this is off my personal page, johnbiethan.com, but this is my current podcast portfolio that are in production. So you can go there at johnbiethan.com to find out, take a listen to those as well. And then finally, I wanted to let you know that All Maven, we have a podcast page up now. Just go to allmaven.agency/podcast, and you can schedule a call with me. You can actually just get started. Okay. So hope you enjoyed this, and really look forward to talking with you. So you can get a hold of me at podcast@allmaven.agency, or just even schedule a call with me right there.